Comrades, it's really appropriate that we would be having this discussion on Afghanistan and the theory of permanent or uninterrupted revolution on this date, September 11th, which exactly 20 years ago to the day really expressed the disaster of capitalism in the former colonial world, where all the crises of capitalism are concentrated and magnified. And in today's New York Times, there's an article talking about how the U.S. is actually expanding its military bases. For one, in the Sahara, from which it runs drone flights to monitor Al-Qaeda and Islamic State militants in Libya, Niger, Chad, and Mali. And it's also doing drone strikes in Somalia, and also considering sending special forces troops there as trainers. And the Times writes, 20 years after the terrorist attacks of September 2001, the so-called war on terror shows no sign of winding down. And our first task as participants in the working class movement and as socialists, our first task is to understand the basis for this crisis. And in order to do that, we have to place it in its historical context, which means understand the general pattern that's developed. And that is what theory is, concentrating and understanding the general patterns of history. And the theory of permanent, or I think a better term is uninterrupted revolution, is essential for understanding that. And that theory explains that first of all, the role of the capitalist class in Western Europe and the United States, where capitalism developed organically out of the developments in those societies themselves. And the capitalist class in that part of the world united a large landmass into one large market with more or less clear rules. In other words, what they call here the rule of law, and largely united the populations in those different countries, even with all the ethnic and regional differences. And it broke the power of the feudal landlord class, or in the US, the power of the slave owners, which in all these countries, it still left the feudal remains, or in the United States, some of the remains of slavery still to this day. But the power of those classes was broken. And towards those ends, it leaned on the working class through the establishment of capitalist democracy. None of this would have been possible without uniting the mass of the population around the idea, the consciousness of being all one people or all one nation. That is, we're all Germans, we're all Belgians, or we're all Americans. That doesn't mean that there weren't divisions and strong divisions within those populations, but still at the end of the day, that was the dominant consciousness. Then you have to compare that to how capitalism was imposed from the outside in the former colonial world. What they did, they went in, the colonial powers, they went into whatever part of the world they entered, and they picked out, they picked out members of the landlord class and similar types. They picked them out in the first place to go into business, to be their representatives in whatever capitalist enterprises they set up, and also to be their political representatives. That was that was the base that they leaned on in order to rule in the former colonial world. So that class, the capitalist class, on the one hand was linked with the old landlord class and could not redivide the land. And also it was linked with the imperialist powers or the colonial powers and could not lead in a serious way any kind of struggle for national liberation. They developed the different nation states from the outside. They imposed it from the outside rather than those nation states developing organically from the development of those societies themselves. And if you look, for instance, at Syria, where the formation of the Syrian nation went hand in hand with the development of all the nations in those areas through the Sykes-Picot Accord, which was an agreement between French and British colonialism after World War I. That was how they established those nations. And in the following, and something similar in similar ways happened throughout the colonial world. In the case of Syria, the French imperialists actually systematically prevented the development of any productive industries that would compete with the French industry. And it's similar in all the former colonial world. And all the old ethnic and tribal traditions were ignored. So that leaves the national question as a huge issue today. And I think that many socialists focus too much, either completely misunderstand the national question, or they overly focus on the issue of, on the economic, on the class conflict, which of course we can't forget, but that national question is a huge issue. And Afghanistan today is a perfect example. And a lot of what I want to talk about is based on this book, which is one of the most interesting history books that I've read in many years. So first of all, you have to understand Afghanistan, as we know, is an extremely mountainous region, and the cultivation of land, that fact, coupled with the availability of water, has meant that only 6% of the land in Afghanistan is subject to cultivation, either because it's too mountainous or because there's no water available. So what happened was you had little population centers develop and little isolated valleys, and that served as a block to the formation of a strong central state, especially in the early conditions with lack of communication and so on. And I'd like to quote from Gopal here. He explains that. So what happened was then the in the early days, at least in some areas, in the predominantly Pashtun areas, which is the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, the peoples originally were lived in the mountainsides and were mainly pastoralists. They lived by herding of sheep and goats and so on. And he says the wealth, and incidentally, I should also say, you know, Gopal, for all the brilliance of this book, Gopal is not a Marxist, and he doesn't fully understand the issue of property and property ownership. He understands it somewhat, but not fully. He says wealth in pastoral societies is a peculiar thing, because being on the hoof, it can wander off or be pilfered or slaughtered. With too little to go around and no state to enforce property relations, fighting could be frequent and beautiful and brutal. You adapted by leaning on those you trusted most. First, your immediate family, then your cousins' cousins, and so on. Clannishness, in other words, was not a symptom of Afghans' preternaturally backward ways, but rather a sensible response to harsh and precarious conditions. So that was the origins of the development of the clan system in Afghanistan. And also, incidentally, as far as male ownership of property, which initially was the was domesticated animals. There's nothing in the Quran that mandates male ownership. This is purely a tradition of some of the tribes living in these more isolated conditions, especially evidently among the Pashtuns. So then what happened was when I'll get to that, but so you have these ancient traditions. Then you have British colonialism. And in some ways, it was a repeat of what happened with the Sykes-Picot Accord, because under a representative of the British colonialists, a guy named Mortimer Durand, he drew up a boundary line. You know, the British had controlled what later became Pakistan. He drew up a boundary line between what's now Afghanistan and what's now Pakistan, called the Durand Line. And that border, and in southern and southeast Afghanistan, divides the Pashtuns between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so the Pakistan state has a vested interest in maintaining Islamic consciousness or Islamic nationalism, for fear that Pashtun nationalism could develop, and then what they could call Pashtun irredentism, in other words, the formation of a Pashtun nation, similar to what's happening with the Kurdish people, that could develop and would threaten the territorial integrity of the Pakistani state. So Durand left like a ticking time bomb there, back in the 19th century. Now, then you have also several other ethnic groups that predominate throughout Pakistan. You have the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, and note just to the north of Pakistan, you have Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Now, so Afghanistan is really divided and into these different ethnic groups without any strong national state, partly because of the geography, the very geography of Afghanistan itself, its mountainous nature. And as Gopal explains, because of that mountainous nature, it was in those early years impossible to develop a strong national state. Now, how about the question of the development of a ruling class in Afghanistan? And previously, I had thought that there was no real landlord class, but it turns out that is mistaken. And incidentally, it's a symptom of the lack of knowledge of Afghanistan. That my previous article on Afghanistan, in which I had basically commented that there was no real landlord class, it got 450 hits, but nobody corrected that. So it really is a symptom of how the overwhelming majority of people outside of Afghanistan really don't understand very much about that. So as far as Gopal, he is not a Marxist, but he doesn't completely understand the issue of the ownership of means of production. But he does give some excellent descriptions, especially in regard to the Pashtun regions in the south and the southeast of Afghanistan. And he describes, as I said, the movement of the pastoralists down into the valleys, and the development then of agriculture. And he describes that when they were pastoralists, then the wealth was more or less equally spread around. Then when they moved down into the valleys, he doesn't explicitly say this, but it appears from what he writes that it was at that time that ownership of land, as opposed to just simply ownership of herds of animals, that land ownership started to develop. And at that point, then you had unequal distribution of wealth and power, at least amongst the men. Of course, between men and women, it always was unequal. But amongst the men, that unequal distribution started to develop. And he also, that development is linked, according to him, with contact being made by, as he puts it, some more enterprising individuals. And in the Pashtun regions, contact being made between them and an earlier, I guess you could say, colonial power, which was the Safavid Empire or Persian Empire. And it was through that connection that that a hierarchy started to develop with the Pashtuns, who were formerly one of the most egalitarian ethnic, had some of the most egalitarian societies, at least amongst the men, in what's now Afghanistan. They became one of the most hierarchical of all, according to Gopal. Connected with that, two forms of law developed, which is to say two forms of state power developed side by side. You had the old tribal laws with clear rules. For example, if you break a man's nose in a fight, you have to give him a chicken. But then along with that, you had religious law started to develop. Religious law as interpreted by the mullahs. Now, who were the mullahs? In some ways, they were American 20th century equivalents of lawyers. They had spent, I think they had to spend like 5 or 6 years studying religion as interpreted by a certain layer of religious leaders. And that this was the origin of the madrasas. And incidentally, so it seems to me, so you had the religious law and then the old tribal laws. And it seems to me that in one way, the Talibans and their they developed, Taliban is the plural of Talib, which just means student. And these were the students in the madrasas. And seems to me that they combined the religious and the old tribal laws. For instance, in some ways it was, religious mandate, but there's nothing in the Quran or in Islamic tradition that mandates that only men can own property. That they brought in from the old tribal laws. Now, one thing that would be interesting to know more about was what was the relationship between the mullahs and the madrasas and those who would acquire the large tracts of land, which is to say the landlords. But it's difficult to imagine that the landlords did not play a big role in the madrasas in one way or another. So also, then you had, of course, the Soviet invasion and in the 1980s and the war against the Soviets, the rise of the Mujahideen, which was financed by the United States, some Saudis and other sheiks, and also through that the layer of the Pakistani state, especially the ISI, which was the Pakistan equivalent of the US CIA. And incidentally, Gopal says that in Pakistan, Afghanistan, what we call the warlords are simply called commanders, military commanders in Afghanistan. These were the commanders of different little small local armies of the Mujahideen that fought against the Soviets. And they were also, they tended to be picked out from the wealthiest, from the landlord class. So there was a link between the commanders or so-called warlords and the ruling class, the ownership of the means of production in Afghanistan. And of course, they were directly linked with foreign foreign imperialist capital. As I said, the USA, some of the Arab sheik capitalists, and also Pakistan. Now, I can't find much mention anywhere of development of any industry throughout Afghanistan, although I think that may be coming because Afghanistan is quite wealthy in some important minerals. But the main power rested on the landlord class who became those military commanders. Of course, the reactionary role of Stalinism helped accelerate this entire process. Now then, when the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in 1989, that left a power vacuum which had to be filled by some force as chaos ruled the nation. And Afghanistan was and still remains one of the few countries in the world, I believe, where the working class is actually objectively too weak to impose its order by taking power. And so a result was that it's almost like a historical accident in a way. Well, not really, but because all accidents are inevitable, that the Taliban came to power to impose order, which was the order of one of the more reactionary regions of rural Afghanistan imposed on the entire country, including on the cities. And there's no state power without international links. And in the case of the Taliban, as I've said, they had links with the Pakistani ISI and also through Al Qaeda and with Arab capitalists. Incidentally, initially, the US welcomed the coming to power of the Taliban. And this created a crisis of its own as expressed exactly 20 years ago today. And I want to read more and write something more extensive on the last 20 years in Afghanistan. But it's pretty clear what happened. When the US invaded, they picked out various commanders, the so-called warlords, who were linked with the landlord class to represent US interests. And I should just note, by the way, that during the period prior to their taking power, to the US coming in, a capitalist class had developed when the Soviets were in there around both poppy cultivation plus smuggling. What Ahmed Rashid in the book Taliban calls the transport mafia, and also the drug dealers or drug smugglers. So that was, as far as I can make out, a central section of the Afghan capitalist class prior to the US coming in, when the Taliban had first taken power. So you had these warlords or commanders who became the suppliers for the US military there. They organized supplies for the troops. They were the construction contractors, for example, at the US air bases. And incidentally, they also seized land not owned by them for that purpose of construction. In other words, they used their ties with US imperialism to increase their wealth and economic power. And they organized private security companies that were really similar to the Blackwater security of Eric Prince. They used their connection with US imperialism to eliminate rivals. They just right, left, and center anybody that was a rival or even a potential rival to their wealth and power. They just went to the US military and said, hey, that guy there, that guy is Taliban. Whether or not they'd ever had any links with the Taliban, in many, many cases, they were Mujahideen who had actually opposed the Taliban, but then they'd be arrested, and several hundred of them were ultimately sent off to Guantanamo. Also, under US occupation, poppy cultivation flourished. So they were in on that. And also, as the poppy cultivation flourished, land values increased. And so they engaged in land speculation. So they were real estate dealers also. So you can see what type of capitalist class is developing in Afghanistan. It's the archetype, the paradigm, the very essence of the degeneracy of 21st century capitalism. mixed in with the dynamics of the laws of development of capitalism in the former colonial world. That is to say, the laws of development of capitalism and its death throes combined with the laws of development that are explained by the theory of permanent or uninterrupted revolution. Now, what would be a strategy for socialists, a working class strategy to deal with this ongoing disaster? And that's not so easy because of the objective weakness of the working class. But we have to keep in mind that the national question is alive and well in Afghanistan. And one important population group there is the Hazaras, who live along the border with Iran, for whom Persian is their native language. And I think that connection is extremely important, because right across the border, you have the powerful Iranian working class in motion. It's unclear at this point to what extent they're taking up either the national question or the question of women's liberation. But if and when, as a working class movement develops in a more overtly political direction, that Iranian working class will be forced as a class to take up those questions. And incidentally, already the Afghan women refugees in Iran are linking up with Afghan women. I mean, with Iranian women. So it's through that then that a working class based movement, I think, could develop in Afghanistan. And the Soviet and the Stalinists proved that that cannot be imposed from the outside. But through that sort of movement, it could link up with women, primarily, but not only with women, and mainly the younger women. And through that, then start to develop a true working class based liberation movement within Afghanistan to resolve the crisis of capitalism, not just in Afghanistan, but throughout the entire region. I do believe that women would have to be the driving force in that movement, but the driving force based on the working class itself. So those are some ideas that I have. The domination, the uncontested domination of US imperialism or US capitalism throughout the world, that situation is rapidly going away. And there's other rivals that are rising, first and foremost Chinese imperialism and also Russian. But none of them will be able to have the dominance, achieve the dominance that US imperialism had. So the breakdown of the old world order is certainly, certainly going on pace, but there's no new real world order. There's a kind of a world disorder that's developing, and that presents a somewhat slightly different, somewhat of a shift in the dangers that that world society faces. Possibly even the majority of those who even consider themselves Trotskyists have really forgotten about the whole theory of the permanent revolution, except in an extreme abstract and academic form. And they never try to, if you believe that this is a general description of history, then you have to try to apply that to each new concrete situation, including whether it be Afghanistan, Syria, or Zimbabwe. And that's what they never ever try to do. And that's what leads them to this kind of confusion, which has been many times described as the red-brown alliance, or the alliance between the left and outright fascists. And it shows why, for us, like for socialists who are serious and want to be part of the working class, that understanding is our first responsibility. I want to make one comment also about where was the US occupation of Afghanistan headed. And this book by Gopal is really brilliant as far as explaining what was going on. And he, I mean, it's just time after time after time after time where the US would side with one corrupt military commander or warlord against another. And on the basis of, well, we're fighting the Taliban. And one who found himself on the losing end of this, and many times, incidentally, it was just simply a matter of kidnappings, where one commander would get some businessman or potential rival kidnapped, quote, arrested, and then they'd have to pay several $1,000s ransom to get him released, and then a few weeks later he'd be kidnapped again. And so there's one guy who was victim of that. He started wondering what he said. Well, could only be one explanation for what the Americans had wrought. They were the world's sole superpower, capable of toppling the Taliban, blah, blah, blah. They were now siding with the Northern Alliance, arresting the wrong people. This was in a different part from the Pashtun area, arresting the wrong people, unleashing a predatory police force. And it couldn't be an accident. And then he started going to the mosque, and he heard the mullahs preaching that what the Americans wanted was colonizing his country and converting the whole population to Christianity, just as the Russians had attempted to enforce communism. And that sounds like a wild conspiracy theory. And I don't think that US imperialism consciously, systematically was planning that. But think about if they had been able to remain in Afghanistan indefinitely and had been able to establish some kind of rule based on their domination, what would have come next? Just as sure as night follows day, you would have had all the goddamn Christian fundamentalist missionaries going over there to Afghanistan and converting people to capitalism / Christianity, or trying to. That would have been part and parcel of it. So it would have been economic, military, and also cultural domination by US imperialism. So just a couple of other points as far as what the women from Kabul were doing about women's rights in the rural areas. Well, again, Gopal explains how one NGO that was, how representatives of the United Nations and also some NGOs recruited women in the rural Pashtun areas to register women to vote for an election when Karzai got elected, largely through fraud, although evidently he was fairly popular in the Pashtun areas because that was the background that he came from. And he describes how that one woman who was involved in that and her husband then subsequently had to go into hiding because the husband did, because his life was under threat, and the husband did ultimately get murdered. And partly it was a result of violating those taboos against women's liberation, against women's rights. But what they would have had to have done to make it successful was organize a movement from below, link it up with the land question, link it up with the corruption, and link all that up with women's rights. But by their very nature, no capitalist force, whether it be Bernie Sanders or the United Nations, no capitalist force can or ever will build a movement from below like that. I think as far as the Taliban, I think Cheryl was talking about linking up with international finance, and the Taliban is trying to link up with international finance because they recognize, I think before they had never really thought about ruling. Don't forget, they were largely, in connection with Al-Qaeda, they weren't the state force, and Al-Qaeda has no strategy for becoming a state power. It just has a strategy of attacking the US and European state capitalists. But now they have learned from their previous rule, And they are trying to, that was what the Doha negotiations were all about, trying to link up with US and European imperialism. And they are going to be trying to get Western loans and so on. They have to. And so in order to do that, they have to moderate some of what they did when, or try to moderate some of what they did as far as oppression of women and so on when they were in power the last time. But that means just that there's going to be divisions within the Taliban, either splits within the Taliban, and the Taliban are not exactly a democratic force that carried on political debates in democratic means. It means that there will be violence within the Taliban, and some members of the Taliban will move over to some of the more extreme groups like ISIS-K and so on, those who aren't thinking about ruling and state power. So
Right.
as far as, and just again, I want to emphasize the necessity for us to try to apply these general theories, especially the theory of permanent or uninterrupted revolution, to try to see how that's worked out in each individual situation, like what's happening in Afghanistan, and also to see it not taken out of its historical context, nor its regional context, and the role of the working class in other parts of that region, and how that working class can work together to help resolve the situation in Afghanistan. And if that develops, by the way, if a real powerful movement of the working class in Iran develops and starts to challenge for power and starts to influence the situation in Afghanistan and other parts of that world, that will completely transform the world situation.